My husband looked at the medals pinned above my heart and laughed. Then, in front of an entire room full of officers, he said the one thing I still can't forget. "Claire, leave some of those off next time. Nobody here cares what you did 20 years ago." A few people chuckled. His mother smiled into her wine glass. Someone at the table added, "Honestly, people who actually did something don't usually need to wear proof." The laughter spread. Not because it was funny, because everyone assumed they knew who I was. Just a retired military wife clinging to old glory. I lowered my eyes to the medals. The silver star, the bronze star, the purple heart. Pieces of a story nobody at that table had ever cared enough to ask about. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. People often mistake silence for weakness. Then the room began to change. Near the entrance, my husband's commanding officer had stopped walking. Commander David Hayes was staring at my medals. Not casually, not politely, like a man who had just recognized something that everyone else in the room had completely missed. And suddenly, the laughter started to die. 3 years before that dinner, I packed most of my military life into boxes and carried them into the garage, not because I wanted to forget, because it seemed easier than explaining myself. At first, Ethan had been fascinated by my service. Back when we were dating, he asked questions. He wanted to hear stories. He wanted to know where I had deployed, what I had done, who I had served with. But something changed after we got married. The question stopped. Then the subject itself disappeared. Over time, my military career became the one topic neither of us touched, as if it belonged to someone else, someone who no longer lived in our house. I was 41 years old, a retired Army major. Most people who met me had no idea, and increasingly, I suspected Ethan preferred it that way. One Saturday morning, I was sorting through storage boxes when I found an old framed photograph. A Black Hawk helicopter stood behind me on a dusty airfield in Afghanistan. I was younger, tired, sunburned, and smiling. Someone had written Kandahar, 2014, across the corner. For a moment, memories returned. The smell of aviation fuel, the constant vibration of rotor blades, the exhaustion that settled into your bones after months overseas. Then the garage door opened. Ethan walked inside carrying grocery bags. His eyes immediately found the photograph, and his expression changed. Not curiosity, not pride, discomfort. "You still keep those?" he asked. I glanced at the picture. "Sometimes." He set the bags down. "You know, most people move on eventually." The comment sounded harmless. That was Ethan's gift, the ability to make hurt sound reasonable. I carefully placed the photograph back into the box. "I did move on." "Good." The answer came too fast, as if he needed it to be true. The truth was more complicated. Ethan had served honorably in the Navy. He worked hard. People respected him. His career was advancing, but unlike many officers at his level, he had never deployed into combat. Most of his reputation was built on potential. Mine had been built on decisions nobody wanted to make, and I think that difference bothered him more than either of us admitted. Later that week, his mother called about the officers' dinner. Apparently, half the local military community would be attending. Senior officers, command staff, families, people whose opinions mattered. After the call ended, Ethan stood quietly in the kitchen. Then he looked at me. "Just keep things simple that night." I already knew what he meant. Meaning, his jaw tightened. Nobody's coming to hear old war stories. The words hung between us. I studied his face, and suddenly I understood something. He wasn't afraid I would embarrass him. He was afraid people might finally see me. Not as his wife. Not as a polite guest at his side, but as someone who had earned a place in that room long before he ever entered it. 2 days later, the official guest list arrived. I almost ignored it, until one name stopped me cold. Commander David Hayes. The first public humiliation happened 4 days before the officers' dinner. It took place at Patricia Whitaker's dining room table. Sunday lunch. Family gathered around polished wood, passing bowls of food and telling the same stories they told every month. Patricia loved these gatherings, not because she loved family, because she loved status. And nothing made her happier than talking about Ethan's future. Halfway through lunch, she lifted her wine glass. I still think Ethan will make captain one day. Several relatives nodded immediately. One cousin laughed. Future admiral. The table erupted with approval. Patricia practically glowed. Then her attention shifted toward me. And Claire will be attending the officers' dinner too. A few heads turned. I smiled politely. Patricia looked me up and down. You know, I've always wondered what exactly you did in the army. The question sounded innocent. It wasn't. I had known Patricia long enough to recognize the difference. I shrugged. A little bit of everything. She laughed. That's usually what people say when they spent most of their time doing paperwork. A few relatives chuckled. I stayed silent. Patricia leaned back, clearly enjoying herself. Honestly, I always pictured you in an office somewhere. Someone farther down the table added, or checking IDs at a gate. Laughter spread again. Then Patricia delivered the line that made my stomach tighten. People who actually did something usually don't need decorations to prove it. The table grew louder. Not everyone laughed, but enough did. Enough for the point to land. I glanced toward Ethan. He was right there, close enough to hear every word, close enough to stop it. All he had to say was, "That's not true." Just 4 words. Instead, he smiled weakly into his drink and said nothing. The silence hurt more than Patricia's comment. Because strangers don't know what they owe you. Family does. I set my fork down carefully. I never asked anyone to prove anything. Patricia waved a dismissive hand. Oh, don't be so sensitive. Sensitive. The favorite word of people who insult you and dislike being noticed for it. The conversation drifted on. A few minutes later, my wallet slipped from my purse and landed on the floor. Ethan's younger cousin Jake bent down to grab it. Something metal slid halfway out. A pair of military dog tags. Jake picked them up. His expression changed immediately. "These are yours." I nodded. He turned them over, reading the information stamped into the metal. Then he looked at me again. Not mockingly, curiously, like someone noticing a piece of a puzzle that didn't fit. Patricia rolled her eyes. See, Army people never let any of that go. Jake ignored her. His gaze remained fixed on the tags. Then he asked a question nobody else at the table seemed prepared for. If she was just doing paperwork. He paused, looking directly at me. Then why does she have combat tags and a Purple Heart? The room went unexpectedly quiet. Even Patricia stopped smiling. And for the first time all afternoon, I realized someone at that table had started paying attention. That night, long after Ethan had fallen asleep, I sat alone on the back porch. The Virginia air was warm and heavy. Crickets hummed in the darkness, and Jake's question refused to leave my mind. If she was just doing paperwork, then why does she have a Purple Heart? I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Almost immediately, Kandahar returned, not as a memory, as a feeling: dust, heat, exhaustion. The constant pressure of knowing that someone else's life might depend on a decision you made in the next 60 seconds. In 2014, I was serving as an operations officer attached to a helicopter evacuation unit in southern Afghanistan. Most days were routine: planning missions, reviewing intelligence, coordinating flights, making sure everyone else had what they needed. The work rarely looked heroic, until something went wrong. Operation Night Lantern began with bad intelligence. A medical extraction team had been sent into an area believed to be relatively secure. The assessment was wrong. Hours later, reports started arriving. The team was pinned down. Several personnel were wounded. Communications were breaking apart, and a dust storm was moving toward the region faster than forecast. Inside the operations center, tension spread quickly. Pilots studied weather reports. Command staff reviewed casualty estimates. Everyone understood the risk. Then someone recommended delaying the extraction. On paper, it was the safest option. Wait for visibility to improve. Reduce the danger to the aircraft. Protect the flight crews. Most people agreed. I almost did too. Then I noticed something. The recommended extraction route looked safer. Too safe. The intelligence gaps were unusually clean. Radio traffic had gone strangely quiet, and the last drone image showed movement near a ridge that should have been empty. I couldn't prove anything. I only knew something felt wrong. One of the senior officers looked at me. "Major, do you support delaying?" Every eye in the room turned toward me. I remember staring at the map, the weather reports, the casualty estimates. Then I thought about the wounded personnel waiting in that valley, waiting for someone to stop debating and decide. No. The room went silent. I pointed toward the map. "If we wait, they're trapped longer." A pilot frowned. "And if you're wrong," I looked directly at him, "then I'll own it." No dramatic speech, no hero moment, just responsibility. The mission launched. For hours, nobody knew whether I had made the correct call. Then the helicopters came home. Damaged, low on fuel, covered in dust, but carrying every surviving member of the extraction team. One of those survivors was a young officer named David Hayes. Back then, he was a captain. Years later, people focused on the medals, the reports, the citations. But those things were never what stayed with me. What stayed with me were the names, the voices on those radios, the people who trusted someone they couldn't even see. I opened my eyes and stared into the darkness. Inside the house, tucked away in an old cabinet, sat the Operation Night Lantern file. And somewhere in Norfolk, Commander David Hayes was preparing to attend the same dinner as Ethan. The same dinner where nobody seemed to think my story mattered. 2 nights before the officers' dinner, Ethan found the medal case. I had left it open on the guest room bed while deciding what to wear. The dark blue velvet case sat beneath the lamp. Inside rested 15 years of service, campaign ribbons, commendations, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the Silver Star. I walked into the room and found Ethan staring at them. Not admiring them, studying them, like they were a problem he hadn't figured out how to solve. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he picked up the Silver Star ribbon. "What exactly are you planning to do with these?" I frowned. "Wear them." His jaw tightened immediately. To dinner. Yes. Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind people use when they're trying not to sound annoyed. Claire. I already knew what was coming. This isn't a retirement ceremony. I stayed quiet. It's not an awards banquet either. Still, I said nothing. Then he finally delivered the line that told me everything. Nobody here cares what you did 20 years ago. The room seemed to shrink around us. Not because the words were loud, because they were honest. Not honest about me. Honest about him. I looked at the medals. Then, at my husband. You really believe that? He looked away first. That's not what I said. It is. Frustration flashed across his face. You know how this looks? I waited. It looks like you're trying to remind people who you used to be. There it was. The real fear. Not the medals. Not the attention. The possibility that someone might remember I had been somebody before becoming his wife. I sat on the edge of the bed. Ethan. He crossed his arms. You served honorably. His eyes narrowed slightly. But you've spent years acting like my service is something embarrassing. That's not fair. No, I said quietly. It's accurate. Silence filled the room. Heavy. Uncomfortable. The kind of silence that appears when both people know the truth has entered the conversation. Finally, Ethan looked at the medal case again. His voice was lower this time. You know what happens when people start asking questions. I stared at him, because for the first time, he had admitted it. Not directly, but enough. People asking questions, people comparing careers, people noticing things. People realizing that the woman beside him carried a story he couldn't control. I gently took the silver star from his hand and returned it to its place. I'm not wearing them to impress anyone. Then why wear them at all? I closed the case. Carefully. Because the answer mattered. Because I'm tired of acting like my life started the day I married you. Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. The truth had left him nowhere to stand. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I almost ignored it. Then I read the first sentence. Major Whitaker. This is Commander David Hayes. And the second sentence stopped me cold. There are some things about Night Lantern that deserve to be remembered. I read Hayes' message 3 times before replying. There are some things about Night Lantern that deserve to be remembered. Most people would have seen it as a polite comment. I didn't. Because I knew David Hayes. Not well. But well enough. He was not the kind of man who said unnecessary things. I sent a brief response. I look forward to seeing you, Commander. Less than a minute later, another message appeared. So do I. Major. Major. Not Claire. Not Mrs. Whitaker. Major. The title hit harder than I expected, because I realized how long it had been since anyone had used it without irony, curiosity, or surprise. The following afternoon, Ethan and I attended a reception on base before the formal dinner. The event was small, mostly officers, spouses, and command staff. Exactly the kind of room Ethan usually thrived in. He moved easily between conversations, promotion boards, assignments, future commands. People listened when he spoke. People respected him, and for years, I had been happy to stand quietly beside him, until recently. At one point, I wandered toward a display area near the back of the room. Several military historians had arranged photographs from past operations. Most guests barely glanced at them. History always seems less interesting when it's hanging on a wall. Then I stopped walking. A familiar image stared back at me. Afghanistan. A helicopter covered in dust. A group of exhausted personnel standing beside it. And near the center of the photograph stood a younger David Hayes. The caption beneath the frame read, Operation Night Lantern. Emergency medical extraction. Successful personnel. Recovery. My chest tightened. Not from pride. From memory. A voice beside me interrupted my thoughts. You know, most people walk right past that picture. I turned. A retired colonel stood nearby. Silver hair. Sharp eyes. The kind of man who noticed things. I smiled politely. I guess they're more interested in the future. He studied me for a moment, then nodded toward the photograph. Funny thing about that operation. What? The colonel folded his arms. A lot of people know the story. He paused. Very few know who made the decision. I felt my stomach tighten. The colonel continued. And the ones who do usually don't forget. Before I could respond, another officer approached him and pulled him away. But his words remained. The ones who do usually don't forget. Across the room, I spotted Ethan laughing with a group of younger officers, completely relaxed, completely unaware. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if two different versions of my life collided in the same room. The version Ethan had spent years shrinking, and the version military people quietly remembered. A few minutes later, movement near the entrance drew everyone's attention. Conversations slowed. Several officers stood straighter. Commander David Hayes had arrived. He greeted a few people politely. Then his eyes swept across the room, searching, until they found me. Recognition flashed immediately. Not uncertainty. Not curiosity. Recognition. And in that moment, I knew something with absolute certainty. Operation Night Lantern was not buried history, and not to him, not anymore. And when the officers' dinner began tomorrow night, Ethan was going to discover exactly why. The officers' dinner took place the following evening. The ballroom overlooked the water. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished floors. Officers in dress uniforms mingled with guests in formal attire. Everything looked perfect. Everything felt fragile. I stood in front of the mirror before we left. The black dress was simple, elegant. Nothing about it demanded attention. The medals did. The silver star, the bronze star, the purple heart. Years of service arranged neatly above my heart. When Ethan walked into the room, his expression immediately darkened. He stared at them for several seconds, then shook his head. You're really wearing all of them. It wasn't a question. I picked up my purse. Yes. He laughed quietly. Not because anything was funny, because he was frustrated. You know what? He grabbed his car keys. Do whatever you want. I followed him toward the door. Then he stopped, one hand resting on the doorknob, and delivered the sentence I would remember for a long time. Just don't embarrass me tonight. The words landed harder than he realized, because they revealed everything. Not concern, not love, not partnership, image, status, fear. I simply nodded. Then we left. The drive to the base felt longer than usual. Neither of us spoke. By the time we arrived, the ballroom was already crowded. People greeted Ethan immediately. Several junior officers approached him. A few command staff members waved him over. As always, he fit naturally into the room. I followed a step behind. The familiar role, the officer's wife, the supportive spouse, the background character. For years, I had accepted it. Tonight felt different. Across the room, Patricia sat with several relatives and military families. The moment she saw me, her eyes dropped to the medals. A look of disbelief crossed her face. Then amusement? Oh my God! Several people turned. She laughed softly. You actually wore every single one. A few guests smiled awkwardly. Patricia leaned toward the women beside her, not quietly enough. Some people really don't know when to let the past go. The women exchanged uncomfortable glances. Nobody joined her laughter. Even so, she didn't stop, because people become bold when they think they're safe. A few minutes later, dinner guests began taking their seats. Ethan stood beside our table speaking with several officers. One of them noticed my medals. Before the officer could ask a question, Ethan smiled, almost automatically. Oh, don't encourage her. A couple people laughed politely. Ethan continued, Trust me, if you ask about those, you'll be here all night. The officers smiled uncertainly. Something about the joke didn't feel right. But Ethan didn't notice, because he thought he still controlled the room. Then movement near the entrance changed everything. Conversations slowed, heads turned. Several senior officers stood. Commander David Hayes had entered the ballroom. His uniform drew immediate attention. So did the respect that followed him. He greeted several people, then paused. His eyes settled on me. More specifically, on the medals above my heart. The smile vanished from his face. And suddenly, for the first time all evening, I felt nervous. Not because I feared what was coming, because I realized it could no longer be stopped. The ballroom had grown quiet by the time everyone was seated. Commander Hayes was still walking toward our table. His eyes never left the medals on my chest. Ethan noticed, so did everyone else. But Ethan misunderstood what he was seeing. He smiled and lifted his wine glass, trying to reclaim the room, trying to stay in control. Ladies and gentlemen, he said with a laugh, before Commander Hayes gets here, let me explain something. A few people looked up. Ethan pointed casually toward my medals. My wife likes bringing the entire museum collection. A handful of nervous laughs followed. Not many. Enough. Then he added the line that sealed his fate. Honestly, nobody here cares what happened 20 years ago. The room fell still, because Commander Hayes had reached our table, and he had heard every word. For several long seconds, he said nothing. He simply stared at Ethan, then at me, then at the medals. Finally, he spoke. Major Whitaker. The title hit the room like thunder. Conversation stopped completely. Hayes stepped closer. His gaze moved across the ribbons. The silver star, then another. The bronze star, then another. The purple heart. No one moved. No one spoke. The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning. Hayes looked directly at Ethan. You called these decorations? Ethan's smile disappeared. I didn't mean no. Hayes cut him off. You did. Every eye in the ballroom shifted toward our table. Hayes turned toward the crowd, then toward me, and his voice softened, just slightly. Her call sign was Sparrow 6. A retired colonel at the far end of the room froze. Someone whispered, My God. Hayes continued. Most of you know Operation Night Lantern. Several officers nodded. Many did. The operation had become a leadership case study years ago. Then Hayes said something that changed the room forever. What most people don't know is who made the decision that saved us. Silence. Pure silence. Hayes looked at me, then back at the audience. The standard route looked safer. He paused, but Major Whitaker saw what everyone else missed. His voice grew stronger. She understood the intelligence gaps were wrong. Another pause. She launched the rescue anyway. Nobody looked away. Not anymore. Hayes's eyes settled on Ethan. Then he delivered the sentence that shattered the last of the man's confidence. "You call them medals." He pointed toward my chest. "I call them the reason my daughter grew up with a father." The impact was immediate. A woman near the stage covered her mouth. Several officers lowered their eyes. Patricia looked as though all the air had left her body. Ethan stood, frozen, alone, without an audience, without a joke, without a place to hide. Then Hayes reached into his jacket, removed a folded commendation summary, and handed it directly to Ethan. Major Claire Whitaker, Operation Night Lantern, Silver Star recipient, reporting operations officer. The proof sat in his hands. Undeniable, for the first time in years. Nobody was telling my story for me. The truth was speaking for itself. I looked around the silent room, then said the only thing that mattered. The truth never needed my anger. I paused. It only needed room to arrive. For several seconds after I finished speaking, nobody moved. Nobody seemed quite sure what to do with the truth. The ballroom remained suspended in silence. Then, slowly, conversations began again. But they were different now. Careful, measured, respectful. The story in the room had changed, and everyone knew it. Commander Hayes remained beside our table for a few more moments. Then a young lieutenant approached. He looked nervous, almost embarrassed. "Ma'am." I turned toward him. He stood a little straighter. "I studied Operation Night Lantern at the Naval Leadership Center." His eyes briefly dropped to my medals, then returned to my face. "It was one of the case studies we used." The lieutenant extended his hand. "It is an honor to meet you, Major." I shook his hand. "Thank you." The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but I noticed something. The lieutenant never once looked at Ethan. Not once. A second officer approached, then a third. Questions followed. Not about my medals. About leadership, decision-making, responsibility. The things Ethan had spent years pretending nobody cared about. Across the table, Patricia sat perfectly still. The confidence she carried all evening had vanished. At one point, another military spouse leaned toward her. "Your daughter-in-law is remarkable." Patricia opened her mouth, closed it, then quietly nodded. For the first time since I had known her, she had no version of the story that made Ethan the center of it. A few minutes later, Commander Hayes prepared to leave. Before he did, he stopped in front of Ethan. The room wasn't silent anymore. But enough people were watching, enough people were listening. Hayes looked directly at him, not angrily. Disappointment is often more powerful. A good officer asks questions before making assumptions. The sentence landed harder than any public reprimand. Ethan swallowed. "Yes, sir." Hayes nodded once, then turned to me. Not Ethan. Me. He offered his hand. "Major Whitaker." I shook it. "It was good seeing you again." The gesture lasted only a moment, yet everyone in the room understood its meaning. Respect, recognition, truth. When Hayes finally left, several people stepped aside to let him pass. Then something happened that would have been unthinkable earlier that evening. One of Ethan's colleagues approached our table. He smiled warmly, but not at Ethan, at me. "Major, if you ever have time, I'd love to hear more about Night Lantern." I thanked him politely. The man nodded and walked away. Only then did I look toward my husband. For the first time all evening, he looked small. Not because anyone had humiliated him, because the image he had carefully protected had collided with reality. And reality had won. Later, as guests began leaving the ballroom, Ethan finally spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Claire!" I turned. His eyes were filled with regret. Real regret. Not embarrassment. Not damage control. Regret. "I'm sorry." I believed him. That was the difficult part. But as we walked into the cool Virginia night, I realized something. An apology can acknowledge a wound. It cannot erase the years that created it. The drive home felt different from every other drive we had ever taken together, not because the silence was uncomfortable, because neither of us was hiding inside it anymore. Streetlights drifted across the windshield. The metals still rested above my heart. For years, I had worn silence like armor. Tonight, I no longer needed it. When we arrived home, I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and carefully removed the metal rack from my dress. The house was quiet. Ethan stood near the doorway, watching, waiting. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know where to start." I looked down at the medals in my hand, then back at him. "Start with the truth." His shoulders sagged. The confidence he carried in public was gone now. All that remained was honesty. For a long moment, he stared at the floor. Then he said something I never expected to hear. "I think I was jealous." The admission hung in the room. Raw, uncomfortable, real. I said nothing. So he continued. "You had stories people respected." He swallowed. "You had experiences I never had." Another pause. "And every time someone found out who you were, I felt smaller." The words hurt, not because they were cruel, because they explained years of behavior, years of silence, years of being minimized, years of pretending my life began the day I married him. Finally, I nodded. "Thank you for telling the truth." Ethan looked up. Hope flickered across his face. Small. Fragile. Then I gently shook my head. "But understanding why you hurt me isn't the same as fixing it." The hope faded. Not completely, just enough. Because some lessons deserve to remain uncomfortable. I walked to the hallway cabinet and opened the metal case. The silver star, the bronze star, the purple heart. For years, I believed hiding them would keep the peace. Instead, it only taught people they could erase parts of me without consequence. Carefully, I placed the medals inside. Not because they no longer mattered, because they no longer needed to defend me. My worth had never lived in metal and ribbon. It lived in the woman who earned them. I closed the case, then turned back toward Ethan. "If we're going to move forward, it has to be different." He nodded immediately. "It will be." I held his gaze. "No." My voice remained calm. "It might be." The distinction mattered. Trust is not rebuilt with promises. It's rebuilt with choices. Daily ones, consistent ones. The kind that take time. For the first time that night, Ethan nodded without arguing. Outside, the Virginia night stretched quietly beyond the windows. Inside, something had finally shifted. Not because Commander Hayes recognized me, not because the room went silent, not because the truth was revealed, because I stopped surrendering it. People often think dignity arrives when others finally see your value. They're wrong. Dignity begins the moment you refuse to hide it. And as I turned off the kitchen light and carried the metal case upstairs, I realized something. The hardest mission of my life was never surviving Afghanistan. It was remembering who I was after years of letting other people decide for me. At last, I remembered. One of the most valuable lessons life can teach us is that silence and weakness are not the same thing. Sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who don't fight for attention, applause, or recognition. They simply carry their truth with dignity, even when others misunderstand them. Never let someone else's insecurity convince you to hide your achievements, your experiences, or your worth. The people who truly matter will never need you to become smaller so they can feel bigger. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been underestimated or judged by people who never took the time to know your story? We'd love to hear from you. And if stories about honor, resilience, quiet strength, and earned respect means something to you, please subscribe and join us for more inspiring stories like this.